Welcome back, fellow mitochondriacs, for an episode of Cancer as a Mitochondrial Metabolic Disease. We are going to continue our series talking about things that can lower your blood glucose, which will ultimately lower your glucose ketone index. So I'm a little concerned because I think that we may be getting a little bit lost in the weeds here, if you can imagine, about the purpose of this portion of the series. And this is cancer as a mitochondrial metabolic disease. And this is using the foundations of a ketogenic diet, a therapeutic ketogenic diet, as being a foundational kind of implementation strategy before the other things can truly be effective and fall in line. And unfortunately, I work with a lot of folks who, despite their unbelievably best efforts, really struggle with getting their blood glucose down to the level that it needs to be, which ultimately will affect their glucose ketone index. So I'm spending a lot of time on this particular part of the series because it is that important. If, I've talked to someone who's extremely influential in the space, who I have a lot of respect for and reverence for. And what he told me was that if your blood glucose is not less than 80 on average, you're not going to do well. And, it doesn't matter how much Dawn or how much HBOT or other things you use, it's not going to go very well. And so I'm just telling you, people are really struggling with getting their blood glucose down to the degree they need to be. And these people are on ketogenic diets. They are tracking their macros. They are fasting. They are doing the right things. And still, it can be very difficult for people. Now, it can be exponentially more difficult if you have a reason why you can't be on a ketogenic diet. And there are reasons why people can't tolerate ketogenic diets. Or if you're metabolically unhealthy systemically, if you have, insulin resistance or diabetes, these are going to make it much, much harder to get your glucose into the ranges where they need to go in order to have success as a whole on metabolic therapy. So that is why I am spending so much time on this. And, it's not that this won't benefit the person who's obese and pre-diabetic. It's not that this won't benefit someone who's either on insulin or not on insulin and is a full diabetic that may or may not have cancer. But this particular, part of the micro series is designed for people who are wanting to implement metabolic therapy, ketogenic metabolic therapy, as Dr. Seafried titled it, and who want maximum success with that, and don't want to spin their wheels or waste a lot of money and time. And, when we get into the more, I guess you'd call it sexy things like the Dawn or other glucose and glutamine inhibitors, mebendazole, IV vitamin C, hyperbaric oxygen therapies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those things, at least most of those things, tend to be very expensive. And if you're not in the, therapeutic ketosis range with a proper glucose and a proper GKI or glucose ketone index, you're going to be spending a lot of money when those are not going to have the effects to the degree that we're going to want to have when our blood glucose is not where it needs to be. So I just wanted to take the time here to reiterate how important this portion of it could be for you. Lowering your A1C, from, let's say, even a normal range, 5.5% to 5%, could be a huge win for you. Going down from 5.5 to 4.5% or 4.7% could be a huge win for you with some of these strategies that on average keep your blood glucose into a more acceptable range and a more workable range, of course, in combination with everything else. So without further ado, let's talk about some additional tools that we have in our tool bag today. So it's interesting because I kind of have a trajectory, right, of where I'd like to take the series. And in particular, I knew for the last week or so that today's video was going to be on prebiotic fibers and probiotics. But when I get into the literature and I get, down the rabbit holes, I actually shock myself sometimes about what I'm able to find. And so it's no difference here today, talking about something as simple as fiber having an effect on multiple systems as usual. In particular, we're talking about, glucose tolerance and glycemic control. But needless to say, I was able to find some really, really cool stuff. And I'll just make a caveat that some of the things we'll talk about today will be talked about in a vacuum of its effects on blood glucose. In particular, what I'm talking about is the use of beta glucans from medicinal mushrooms, because although those beta glucans act as prebiotic fibers, and we'll talk about how they work and how much they can work on your behalf of lowering your blood glucose, I'm going to have an entire series, pretty long, probably series after we hit glucose and glutamine and some of the other key signaling pathways that are important for shutting down Warburg metabolism. But I'm going to have an entire series based on medicinal mushrooms, because although from what I can tell, at least in the literature that I've seen, they don't necessarily act on the pathways that are probably most critical to metabolic, theory of cancer, Warburg effect, fermentation and utilization, heavy utilization and reliance on glutamine. They have a lot of benefits, and there's been a lot of study done, in particular about certain medicinal mushrooms like reishi and turkey tail, et cetera. So we will have an entire series on that. So I just want to make that caveat before I get started, because I'm going to be talking about them today. But again, very siloed information looking at their effects on blood glucose. So the first paper I published, or that I pulled, was titled "Harnessing Prebiotics to Improve Type 2 Diabetes Outcomes." And it was published just a couple of months ago, October of 2024. And it says, the gut microbiota, a complex ecosystem of microorganisms in the gastrointestinal tract, GI, plays a crucial role in maintaining metabolic health and influencing disease and susceptibility. So we have, in general, like 3 to 5 pounds of bacteria in our colons. And we have a lot of control over those organisms, what organisms grow and what organisms don't grow. And we're exposed to things that kill off microorganisms, things like antibiotics. It can have profound effects for a long time after the very short course of antibiotics is over on our gut microbiome. So this is pretty critical here. Dysbiosis, or an imbalance of gut microbiota, has been linked to the development of type 2 diabetes mellitus through mechanisms such as reduced glucose tolerance and insulin resistance, increased insulin resistance. A balanced gut microbiota, or eubiosis, is associated with improved glucose metabolism and insulin sensitivity, potentially reducing the risk of diabetes-related complications. Various strategies, including the use of prebiotics like inulin, fructooligosaccharides or FOS, galactooligosaccharides like GOS, resistant starch, pectin, oligosaccharides, polyphenols, beta-glucans, and Dendrobium officinale, have been shown to improve gut microbial composition and support glycemic control in type 2 diabetes mellitus patients. These prebiotics can directly impact blood sugar levels while promoting the growth of beneficial bacteria, thus enhancing glycemic control. Studies have shown that type 2 diabetes mellitus patients often exhibit a decrease in beneficial butyrate-producing bacteria like Roseburia and Faecalibacterium, and an increase in harmful bacteria such as E. coli and Prevotella. The review aims to explore the effects of different prebiotics on type 2 diabetes mellitus and their impact on gut microbiota composition and potential and personalized dietary interventions to optimize diabetes management and overall health outcomes. So I thought this was a really kind of a really good place to start, not only because it's a really, recent paper, but because it has amazing graphics. So as it showed here, it says the use of many probiotics like inulin, fructooligosaccharides, galactooligosaccharides, resistant starch, pectin, et cetera, et cetera. And what I liked about this paper was that it showed the amount of inulin, in this case, per food. And the only thing I would say is that, and maybe it showed in the kind of caption that I cut off or something like that, is that it doesn't say how many grams of this inulin fiber there is per gram of food. So that's the only thing that I don't like about these graphics, but I'll digress. So you can see that garlic, chicory root, artichoke, Jerusalem artichoke, even cacao and chocolate, shallots, agave, chives, rye, grain, and onions all have varying amounts of this inulin fiber, with garlic being the most. So if you end up looking at like inulin fibers that you can buy on Amazon, it'll usually be either artichoke or Jerusalem artichoke, or it'll be chicory generally, probably because it's the most neutral flavored and not going to throw flavors of different foods and beverages you make. For example, in my smoothie this morning, I had some inulin from Jerusalem artichoke, and it actually has a nice, really like almost like a sugar type consistency, almost like a powdered sugar type consistency. And you can add quite a bit in terms of grams without throwing the flavor. As a matter of fact, it actually adds a little bit of sweetness to it as well, which is kind of neat. So here's inulin. We'll talk about these all at length. Here's resistant starches. So we have potato starch, green bananas, mung beans, purple sweet potatoes, black beans, a variety of different beans, yellow sweet potatoes, oats, etc. That's resistant starch. And then for fructooligosaccharides, you see that they're in dandelion leaves, Jerusalem artichokes, chicory root, agave, leeks, onions, wheat flour, asparagus, wheat bran, artichoke hearts. And so I want to show this first, because we're going to start talking about some of these kind of in more detail about what the power, how powerful are these, when taken through your diet or as a supplement on your blood glucose and your A1C. And then you see the galactooligosaccharides are mostly in lentils, beans and lentils, excuse me, with a little bit of whole grains. And when, let's say hypothetically you wanted to add, this to your diet, which one would you pick? Well, we'll look at how effective each one well, not each one, but several of these are at improving glycemic control. But considering, galactooligosaccharides are mostly found in grains, lentils, and beans, which are not exactly keto, maybe you wouldn't, focus on that. Or if you're going to pick foods for either fructooligosaccharides or resistant starches or inulin, you would potentially want to pick foods that would most be supportive of your blood glucose. So things like, garlic, artichoke, shallots, chives, onions, probably going to have the least effect on your blood glucose. Sweet potatoes probably would have more of an effect than the other things. And then we start getting to like potato starches and stuff like that. That's probably like actually not a great place to get foods. Leeks would probably be a good one too. Dandelion leaves. So my point is, wheat flour would not be the ideal, or wheat bran, or oats or something like that, potentially, if you're on a ketogenic metabolic therapy, or wheat bread, because you're never going to reach the glucose levels that you're going to be looking for when you're not on a ketogenic diet. And so you're kind of like throwing one beneficial thing in and taking one out. Now, we did talk about people who may or may not be able to be on ketogenic metabolic therapy because for various reasons. Then the conversation could be, what's the least glycemic load and what's the least glycemic index that's going to not raise my blood sugar as much as possible while getting me the maximum amount of some of these fibers that can help lower my blood glucose. That's a discussion between you, your doctor, nutritionist, et cetera. But just kind of throwing some of these ideas out here. So this is a very busy slide, and I'm not going to read off everything, but I do want to maybe hit a couple of these. So what this is essentially looking at, okay, is it's looking at various prebiotics, okay, whether it be polyphenols or insulin or resistant starches or fructooligosaccharides or whatever, and it'll say in general kind of what bacteria will be stimulated to grow because it feeds those good bacteria, right? And what of the bacteria are growing or being suppressed when those are in there as well, which I think is kind of interesting. So this is a neat graphic that comes from this particular paper here, Harnessing Probiotics to Improve Type 2 Diabetes Mellitus Outcomes, published in Nutrients 2024, if you want to get a hold of these graphics. And this is another pretty neat graphic. So, again, this is looking at prebiotics, kind of fiber as a whole, okay, looking at kind of general mechanisms of action. So we have our prebiotics, right? And we see that we're increasing, through basically feeding, prebiotics basically are feeding your probiotics or your good bacteria what they need so they can then make other hormones and chemicals that help us have a better situation. So for example, let's just start at the top right. When we take in prebiotics, it can help to stimulate the overall NRF2 axis, okay? And it can help upregulate the antioxidant response effects within normal cells, in particular cells that are kind of under assault from hyperglycemia, inflammation, oxidative stress, such as the pancreatic beta cells, which allows them to then perform better, survive, of course, because when they're getting killed off, they're not able to produce insulin. And when you don't have insulin, then you become hyperglycemic and you then require insulin, right? Going to the top right here, when the pancreas is healthier, it's able to secrete the neurochemicals, the GLP-1s and the PYYs and so on and so forth, which can help with a lot of different bodily processes, but namely to help with insulin and decreasing your blood glucose, okay? And then because these prebiotics are feeding the probiotics, then the probiotics, these if you remember from this particular abstract, it said that, what did it say? It said, here we go. Studies have shown that type 2 diabetes mellitus patients often exhibit a decrease in beneficial bacteria that produce butyrate, right? So one of the ways that we improve our health through prebiotics is that we feed the good bacteria, and these good bacteria are butyrate producing bacteria, and then they create our short chain fatty acids, butyrate, propionate, acetate, right? And then those can be used for various things. We've even talked about, butyrate being an inhibitor of glutamine cysteine antiport, SLC7A11, I believe. So, then there's downstream effects, which can be beneficial for cancer as well. So we get to increase butyrate without taking a supplement of butyrate. And then in addition to that, it has an anti-inflammatory effect, because when you have overgrowth of pathogenic or harmful bacteria or bad bacteria, that can lead to leaky gut syndrome, increases in endotoxins and pro-inflammatory cytokines, and kind of a chronic inflammatory state that can lead to insulin resistance. Whereas when we have the healthy kind of balance of bacteria, let's see here, where you have good amounts of a balance basically of good and bad bacteria, hopefully favoring the good bacteria, then the barriers are more intact, and signaling downstream happens better because there's not these kind of reactive oxygen species and inflammatory markers that are kind of messing things up. So that's kind of the general mechanism of how prebiotics work. So I'm going to start by talking about, one of probably the most famous, fibers and prebiotics called psyllium. And psyllium comes from this plant here, this Plantago genus plant. And this paper is titled "The Beneficial Effects of Psyllium on the Prevention of and Treatment of Cardiometabolic Diseases." And it was published in 2022 in this Functional Foods Journal, or Food Functional Journal. And it says here that cardiometabolic diseases are reaching epidemic proportions worldwide. Dietary fiber intake can improve the risk factors associated with cardiometabolic diseases. Psyllium, especially its husk, is one of the most widely used dietary fiber supplements, which is often used to enrich cereals and other food products. Numerous pharmacological studies have investigated the active ingredients and therapeutic effects of psyllium and its extracts, including antioxidant, anti-tumor, anti-diabetic, hypotensive, anti-inflammation, neuroprotective, antidiarrheal, antiviral activities. In this review, we'll summarize the available studies on the therapeutic potential and possible mechanisms of psyllium in treating cardiometabolic diseases such as hyperlipidemia, diabetes mellitus, and complications, hypertension, hyperuricemia, and obesity, and its applications in food systems. And I kind of pulled, a couple of the graphics that were in this paper. Number one, I pulled just the plant itself. And then this is the chemical structures of several of the kind of active ingredients within the psyllium plant, which are having, positive effects. And then this particular, graphic is showing kind of its mechanism of how it is, working. So obviously this is the gut lumen, okay, and it's forming like a gel in the colon, which is going to help bind with bile acids. It's going to help with excretion of those bile acids, which is part of our detoxification mechanisms. Cholesterol is also part of that as well. So that's how it lowers cholesterol. It grabs onto the cholesterol and pulls it out of the system, ultimately, which leads in decreased serum cholesterol. And then it increases the viscosity of the actual stomach kind of mixture called chyme, and that degrades. It decreases the degradation and absorption of glucose and other nutrients. We've seen this mechanism, similar mechanism, in some of the other compounds we talked about, and its ability, in some of their abilities to like block like alpha galactosidase and glucosidase and different alpha amylase, etc. Basically, the enzymes in the small intestine that are responsible for breaking down these more complex carbohydrates and breaking them down into more simple carbohydrates so they can be absorbed. This is actually kind of a different mechanism. It's just basically making it to where the gel forming kind of fiber will just kind of like take up some of these glucose and carbohydrates and not allow them to be available to the pancreatic brush border, or not pancreatic, but the brush border enzymes, and allow them so they're not absorbed as well, or they're absorbed more slowly. So it kind of, let's say hypothetically you ate, I don't know, a cherry or a blueberry or something like that, and your blood sugar kind of goes like this. If you eat it with more fiber, it's gonna maybe have the same glycemic effect, but a much more blunted response, and to make it, so you're not spiking your blood sugar when you're eating, and having a more kind of sustainable kind of rise in your blood sugar, et cetera. So it just helps with that. And then because it provides us with a kind of a feeling of fullness, it's going to help with appetite. And then that's going to ultimately, have an effect on body weight. Now, what was shown here is that it's going to also lower serum blood glucoses, which is kind of what we're talking about for this particular study, or this particular part of the series, because we want to lower our blood glucose and ultimately lower our glucose ketone index. But I don't want to talk about this completely in a vacuum. So you can see that psyllium has effects on high cholesterol, diabetes and its complications, obesity, high blood pressure, and high uric acid levels. Okay. And it has a variety of mechanisms of how it does that. So psyllium, although simple and extremely cheap, has some pretty powerful effects. So what happens when we add psyllium to someone's diet and we check them after a certain period of time for their glycemic control. So this paper was published in 2016. It says soluble fibers from psyllium improve glycemic response and body weight among diabetes type 2 patients, randomized controlled trial. And these people were non-smokers, at least 35 years old. They got 10 grams of psyllium per day, which is about 2 teaspoons. And they got basically this daily for 8 weeks. Okay. So after 8 weeks of intervention, soluble fiber supplementation showed significant reduction in the BMI when compared to control. Moreover, water soluble fiber supplementation proven to improve fasting blood glucose from 163 to 119. Wow, that's a huge drop. That's a darn near a 40-point drop in your fasting blood glucose, which of course corresponds with this very large A1C drop of 1%. Okay, this is on target with metformin and other pharmaceutical agents that cost, well, not metformin doesn't cost, but other pharmaceuticals cost a lot of money and have a lot more side effects. So therefore, if it was me as a first intervention, this would be an easy one. Add it to your smoothies. You can drink it straight. It's not fantastic tasting, but it's also not awful. Kind of gums up a little bit. So I personally would put in a smoothie. But yeah, you lower your A1C by 1% just by doing 10 grams of fiber for just 8 weeks. I mean, this, if you remember back from some of the other studies we've looked at from, very powerful substances like, berberine or cinnamon or chromium or other things, a lot of the studies that we see, they have, half the amount of benefit or maybe slightly a little bit more. But those studies are ongoing of like 3 and 4 months, 6 months at a time to get that effect. Whereas this is a 2-month study with 10 grams of fiber a day, and you're getting a 1% decrease in A1C, which is pretty unbelievable. So, again, this is this whole series is geared to lower your blood glucose, lower your GKI, for metabolic therapy. But if you are a non-cancer person and you have diabetes and you're struggling, this could be an easy, simple way to not only improve your bowel health and have better bowel movements and improve your gut bacteria and different things and inflammation levels and oxidative stress levels and all the other things that fiber does on a variety of systems, right? But it also is going to have a profound effect on your blood glucose as well, lowering your A1C by 1% on average. So it's pretty unbelievable. So there was another study that was done. It was published in May of 2024, and it's titled "Increasing Dietary Fiber Intake for Type 2 Diabetes Mellitus Management: A Systemic Review." And it seems like this was a meta-analysis, or this is a systemic review, and they looked at dietary fiber and some of the studies used acarbose, and some of the studies used just dietary fiber supplements. So it's really hard to know what those were without really digging into the actual meta-analysis. And then they use a high fiber diet just in general, people who ate more kind of green leafy vegetables and things that have, these fiber compounds in it. And, overall, most studies indicated that increased dietary fiber intake resulted in improvements in glycemic control and weight management. And when you actually had to dig into the paper to figure out what the actual reduction was, on average, you're looking at a 1.1% reduction in A1C, which is unbelievable. It's really hard to underscore how powerful dietary fiber is in the form of, so far we've talked about psyllium, but we have a couple other fibers we're going to be talking about in this particular video. And, to lower your A1C by 1 to 1.1%, I mean, that's double, almost double berberine. And most things we've looked at, vitamin D, melatonin, cinnamon slightly better than that. It's like, I've seen it about 0.8%. The best so far has been milk thistle. Funny enough, it's 1.25% in meta-analyses. So it's up there towards, it's clearly better than metformin and most pharmaceuticals, because most pharmaceuticals have about a 1% decrease in A1C. So something to consider for sure. adding to your regimen. Now, the next one I want to talk about kind of at a more granular level is inulin. And I'm going to start with this particular paper title that was published in 2023, August, in Frontiers of Immunology. And that is titled Immunomodulatory Effects of Inulin and its Intestinal Metabolites. And it says dietary fiber, DF, refers to a type of carbohydrate that cannot be digested fully. Dietary fiber is an essential nutrient, is not an essential nutrient, but it plays an important role or important part in enhancing digestive capability or capacity and maintaining intestinal health. Therefore, DF supplementation in the daily diet is highly recommended. Inulin is a soluble dietary fiber and commonly added to foods. Recently, several studies have found that dietary fiber supplementation of inulin can improve metabolic function and regulate intestinal immunity. Inulin is fermented in the colon by the gut microbiota, and a series of metabolites is generated. Among these metabolites, short-chain fatty acids provide energy to intestinal epithelial cells and participate in regulating the differentiation of immune cells. Inulin and its intestinal metabolites contribute to host immunity, our immune system. This review summarizes the effect of inulin and its metabolites on intestinal immunity and the underlying mechanisms of inulin in preventing diseases such as type 2 diabetes mellitus, inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, and chronic kidney disease, and certain cancer types. So inulin is pretty cool also. And I would say it's probably less well known than psyllium, but it's kind of, you know, a little bit of I don't want to say a fad, but it's got more attention in the recent years. So this is just a graphic from this particular paper. This paper had pretty cool graphics. So it's showing, you know, all the areas in which inulin by itself can help, right? So for metabolic syndrome, for example, it improves glucose and lipid metabolism, alleviates insulin resistance. For CKD or chronic kidney disease, reduces the production of uremic substances and inhibits inflammation. For inflammatory bowel disease, such as Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, limits intestinal inflammation, improves intestinal mucosal immunity, decreases bloating, diarrhea, or increased bowel movements that are often seen in those conditions. And then allergic diseases as well, because again, it's having an effect on our immune system. Inhibits Th2 response from food allergies and asthma. As a non-inflammatory polyinsaccharide adjuvant, helps with itching, wheezing, difficulty breathing. So pretty cool from an atopic perspective and an allergic perspective. And then cancer promotes the recruitment and activation of immune cells, induces a Th1 anti-tumor response, promotes this is interesting. I'm gonna say it. I don't know if this is true or not, but it says promotes carcinogenesis and facilitates colorectal cancer progression, induces cholestasis and hepatocellular carcinoma. That I'm gonna have to look into. I've not seen it have a negative effect on cancer, but I'll digress. So the mechanisms of how this works. So basically, here we have inulin fiber that is being absorbed, and this looks like small intestine to me. I don't know if it's labeled or not. So anyway, we have intestinal bacteria. Probably it could be colon, I guess. So we don't have a lot of bacteria in our small intestine unless we have like a SIBO problem or something like that. So maybe this is colon. So we see that inulin fiber is working with the primary and secondary bile acids. It's having effects on short chain fatty acids through the improvements in colonic bacteria. It's then going to, by itself and through the use through these chemical mediators from the bacteria, it's going to have effects on lowering inflammation, improving glycemic control, histone acetylation, it looks like, as well as, I mean, it looks like it's blocking tumor growth here. So I'm guessing that was probably a misnomer when it said, because this is from the same paper, it says promotes carcinogenesis. I mean, the graphic that it goes along with it is that it's blocking tumor growth and having an anti-tumoral effect. So my gut tells me, no pun intended, well, maybe some pun intended, that this is probably meant to be the opposite. it actually halts carcinogenesis and facilitates, and inhibits progression of colorectal cancer. But I need to look into that, because there's obviously conflicting data here on at least on the further down the paper. But then it says preventing diseases such as certain cancer types. So, like I said, my gut tells me this is just a typo on this graphic, but we'll put that on the side for now. So again, having a very holistic effect on our immune system, on our inflammation status, on our gene acetylation and different things that can happen with that, as well as having kind of an immune balancing act that, from what I've seen in this paper, but other papers, seems to actually have an anti-cancer effect. So likely has an anti-tumor effect. The next paper is titled Inulin Fermental Fiber Ameliorates Type 1 Diabetes via IL-22 and Short-Chain Fatty Acids in Experimental Models. And this was a paper published in 2021. And it says here that relative to grain-based chow, GBC, the low-fiber diets exacerbated or made worse the drug-induced diabetes in these mice or rats, whereas diets enriched with inulin, but not cellulose, strongly protected against and or treated it. Inulin's restoration of glycemic control prevented loss of adipose depots while reducing food and water consumption. Inulin normalized pancreatic function and markedly enhanced insulin sensitivity. Such amelioration of diabetes was associated with alterations in gut microbiota composition, which was eliminated by antibiotic administration. So that's interesting. So what they did was they basically gave these mice or rats diabetes. They used drug-induced diabetes, right? It was mice in this case. They gave them diabetes, and then they gave them inulin, right? And the inulin like reduced their diabetes or prevented it or made it so it's not as bad. And then they were able to reverse the good effects by giving antibiotics, right? So when they gave antibiotics, it killed off all the good bacteria that they were building up with the inulin. And then that showed basically the benefit was eliminated. Pharmacologic blockade of fermentation reduced inulin's beneficial impact on glycemic control. So then what they did was they stopped the fermentation as well from the good bacteria of this inulin fiber. And that also showed the reduction in its beneficial impact, showing that there is a distinct like kind of reliance on the colonic bacteria, the good bacteria that actually create the benefit, indicating a role for short-chain fatty acids. Furthermore, inulin's microbiota, this drug-induced diabetes as well, acid-dependent mechanism, and there's a short mechanisms. They both seemingly require the bacteria in the colon for it to work. But again, one mechanism is through short-chain fatty acids. One is through like an inflammatory cascade, and one is through, it seems like, other signaling cascades, which I thought was pretty interesting. Furthermore, this paper that was titled Dietary Supplementation of Inulin Alleviates Metabolic Disorders in Gestational Diabetes Mellitus Mice, AKT, IRS, GLUT4 pathways, and in a dose-dependent manner. To a point, the better the glycemic control you're going to have by decreasing fasting blood glucose, advanced glycation end products. Remember, that's when sugar attaches itself to things it's supposed to, and it damages it, right? That's hemoglobin A1C is glycated hemoglobin, right? Advanced glycation end products and improving glucose tolerance. It did this by suppressing this resistant RTN expression was observed in the inulin treatment group, and the expression was significantly correlated with fasting blood glucose levels. The ratio of PIRS and IRS and PAKT, in the liver tissue, and the ratio of that PAKT and to AKT in adipose tissue, as well as the expression of these glucose transporter, this GLUT4, increased significantly after inulin treatment. So we're kind of getting into the molecular machinery of how inulin works once it's into this to the actual body, right? So basically what happens is through likely, again, still requires the colonic bacteria, but they're able to lower this resistin expression product, which then has effects on the insulin receptor functioning, as well as GLUT4 or glucose uptake channels, right? That allow for glucose to be emptied out of the bloodstream more effectively, lowering blood glucose, lowering insulin, lowering all the kind of like complications of diabetes, as well as what we're really caring about is providing a competitive playing field against the available glucose in the bloodstream, right? So we know that the cancer cells are going to upregulate their GLUT transporters, and they're going to be upregulating glucose uptake by 10 to 30 times, 10 to 30 fold more than a normal cell around it. So the lower we can get that blood sugar, the less it has the availability to get that blood sugar out of the bloodstream and use it for the Warburg metabolism and all the other, downstream effects. Now, we have other things we want to do down the line, blocking glucose transporters, blocking glucose utilization through the actual glycolysis pathways. But if we can just limit its availability in the bloodstream so it can't take it out of the bloodstream, that would be probably step number one, and probably the easiest, frankly. This next paper is titled Recent Advances in Inulin Polysaccharide Research, and it says extraction, purification, structure, and bioactivities. And again, this is just showing that it has immunoregulation, promotes mineral absorption, has an antioxidant effect, it has hypoglycemic effects, anti-inflammatory effects, probiotic effects, etc. And I kind of pulled this because it has really neat graphics, just like some of the other papers did. And this is showing its effect on inflammatory cascades. This is showing its effect on cardiometabolic health. So this is looking at like triglycerides, total cholesterol, LDL, HDL, et cetera, inflammatory mechanisms, which can, affect blood glucose. It's also going to have effects on the short chain fatty acids, which we saw as being one of the mechanisms of how glucose is improved. There's also short chain fatty acid independent mechanisms, right? We talked about. Then it has effects on the gut brain axis, which affects appetite. And it's just these chemicals and these mechanisms are so beautiful and so really like eloquent. And we're just learning. If you want my honest opinion, I think we're probably just scratching the surface about how this stuff works, but it just is unbelievable how many areas that just one particular substance, a short chain, a fructooligosaccharide like inulin is having on our entire system as a whole, kind of improving our entire system, really. Our entire system is improved and bettered by this. Of course, we're looking at it from a very narrow lens, or attempting to look at it from a narrow lens. It's hard to, because we have so many different, beneficial effects on so many different systems, but we're trying to look at it from the lens of blood glucose. So what happens when we add basically inulin to our diet, and what is, what kind of glycemic control are we able to get? So this was a systemic review and meta-analysis of 33 randomized controlled trials, and this was published in 2019. And it showed ultimately that we see a decrease in A1C of about 0.58%. Okay, and then another newer meta-analysis happened the year after that, and that was titled "Efficacy of Inulin Supplementation on Improving Insulin Control, A1C, HOMA-IR, in Patients with Type 2 Diabetes mellitus," or type 2 diabetes, a systemic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. And in this particular meta-analysis, it looks like they looked at 225 different trials, but they selected 9. So the inclusion criteria may have been a little more stringent, or they were looking for specific methodology. I'm not sure why it was using a smaller population size, but ultimately it showed a very similar and even a slightly better effect, right? So the A1C drop from inulin supplementation, according to the most recent meta-analysis in 2020, was about 0.7%, 0.69%, which is pretty darn good. It's not quite the level of psyllium, so, the question is why psyllium is slightly, more effective, than inulin. when they kind of like have a very similar mechanism of action? Great question. I don't know the answer to it. I would just say that maybe, although they both have similar mechanisms, they both grow out bacteria that are more butyrate producing. Maybe psyllium has a stronger effect on those bacteria. It's hard to really know. But anyways, I wanted to present this because it's still very profound. 0.7% is on target with, cinnamon. It's on target with, chromium. It's on target. It's better than berberine, right? So again, a lot of beneficial effects and strong beneficial effects on A1C and average blood glucose when looking at some of these fibers. And just to not get lost in the weeds here with some of these numbers. So let's say hypothetically, your hemoglobin A1C is 6.5%. You're right at the diabetes mark, and you lower your A1C by 1% or 1.1% in the case of psyllium. You're lowering your average blood glucose from 140 to 108. Okay, that's a huge beneficial drop, right? If we are, just to make things easy, let's say we had a 6.7% and we used inulin fiber, and we dropped our hemoglobin to 6.0%, we've now dropped our average blood glucose of more than 20 points, 21 points. So that's pretty cool. Is there synergistic effects of these? If I give you psyllium and if I give you inulin, will I see an additive effect? My gut tells me, again, pun intended, there probably is an additive effect. Will it be like 1 + 1 = 2? Maybe not. It may be like 1 + 1 = 1.5 or something like that. Or maybe it's more. Maybe it's 1 + 1 = 3. I mean, the thing is, we don't really have the studies, unfortunately, to know. But I think that would be an interesting study to be done, is start to combine some of these things. What happens when you take cinnamon and berberine and milk thistle and chromium, and then you add in these prebiotic fibers? Like, what kind of how powerful is this? When we start to combine these things, that's what we don't really know yet. So that is inulin, and we're about 49 minutes in. So let me hit beta glucans quickly here. So I want to cover beta glucans again from a very siloed perspective. Their effects on blood glucose. Okay. Obviously, there are multiple effects that are going to be observed, and I'm going to try my best to kind of hit on them, but not go deep on them. Okay. So this paper is titled "A Concise Review of the Molecular Structure and Function Relationship of Beta Glucan." And we see here that beta glucan is a non-starch soluble polysaccharide widely present in yeast, mushrooms, bacteria, algae, barley, and oats. Beta glucan is regarded as a functional food ingredient due to its various health benefits. The molecular weight and high viscosity of beta glucans are responsible for its hypocholesterolemic and hypoglycemic properties. And you see here that there are various beta glucans. There's 1,6, 1,3, 1,4, different structures of beta glucans from different foods and food sources. And you see it has effects on the immune system, has effects on tumor growth, effect of a wide variety of cancer. This is looking at a lung cancer model, a liver cancer model, has antibacterial effects, has effects on gastric cancer and gut viscosity, as well as cholesterol. So a lot of beneficial effects. And again, we're going to have an entire micro series, or maybe even macro series, on medicinal mushrooms and their ability to help us for cancer. But that being said, I'm going to look at beta glucans again from a glycemic control perspective. So this is just a table from the paper, and it shows that oats on average have about 4.5 to 5% beta glucans, barley 4.5%, whole rye flour 1% to 2.5%, Saccharomyces cerevisiae is about 5 to 7%. And then I looked up, because obviously these are like Latin names, I don't necessarily know what they are off the top of my head. I had to Google it. This is like a little protozoa. Obviously, we're not going to be eating that. And there's several other kind of like things that I don't think are going to be available to eat. But there are some things that are available to eat, such as Inotis obliquus, which is 3.1%, and Coriolis versicolor, which is 46.5%. So what the heck are those? Well, these are things you probably have heard of. So has anybody heard of chaga mushroom? Well, chaga mushroom is this Inotus ubiquus, Latin term, and it has about 3.1% beta glucans. And then I just pulled this from this paper showing what chaga mushroom looks like and has all the effects that it has, unbelievable effects. It's called the queen of the medicinal mushrooms, according to David Wolf, if you remember, if you know him. And so, it's got an unbelievable, multiple system effects. Obviously, we're looking at it from a hypoglycemic perspective. And then the other one, which is Coriolus versicolor or Trimedes versicolor, aka turkey tail mushroom, also a very hot topic within cancer. Okay, and again, which is why I have to do a series on medicinal mushrooms. But anyway, this has a 46.5% of its dry weight is these beta glucans, right? So just know that when you pick something for its beta glucan content, it is known. Now, I would love to them have put in like some other things like lion's mane and reishi, of course. I'd like to see what reishi's is, etc. Now, there are also something called alpha glucans, and alpha glucans may even be more powerful at stimulating the immune system. But we'll talk about that when we talk about medicinal mushrooms and all their unbelievable effects on immunity and cancer down the line. So just wanted to introduce those two, which are available, sources of beta glucans. Again, would I want to use oats or barley or whole wheat? Probably not only because I don't personally do grains, but also because, if I'm on a ketogenic diet, trying to lower my blood glucose as low as possible, I don't want to do foods that are essentially like, 90+% carbohydrate. Not that they're evil or bad. I just don't think they're going to be on most of our plates who are trying to implement metabolic therapy. So just, pick your source, which is why I kind of pick those medicinal mushrooms out, because they have additional anti-cancer effects that could be, also helpful. So this paper is titled Biomedical Aspects of Beta-Glucan on Glucose Metabolism and Its Role on Primary Gene PIK3R1. And it says here that beta-glucans play a significant role in regulating the PI3K-AKT axis via IRS1, PIK3, P85, and phosphorylated AKT, which increases insulin sensitivity and reduces the associated risks. Additionally, administration of these polysaccharides boosts GLUT4 concentrations, aka it increases the GLUT4 glucose transporter, so that allows more glucose to get into the cell and in the pancreas, and depresses glycogen synthase, kinase 3 beta across most cells, indicating that beta-glucan serves as an anti-diabetic drug by activating this axis and transduction pathways. And it shows here that beta-glucans, they reduce cholesterol, they modulate the gut microbiome, because we're talking about effects on the glycemic control. And since this is acting as a prebiotic fiber, essentially, in some way, it's going to help modulate the gut microbiome, similar to the other chemicals we've looked at today. And then it's going to reduce blood glucose. And then that's going to reduce the risk of other medications, or reduce the use of other medications as well, hopefully, and then increase the gastrointestinal viscosity. And this is just another graphic from the same paper saying that, okay, I have ingested my beta glucans and I'm a type 2 diabetes mellitus patient, right? It affects my pancreas, my pancreatic beta cells. My pancreatic beta cells, are the islet cells in particular, are being affected. It's affecting this gene and this PIK3 AKT pathway, which is going to upregulate GLUT4 transporters, as well as make insulin basically work better, and ultimately lower. It's going to have a reduction in glycemic. I don't know if that's really a good way to say it. Reduction in glycemic control, because you would think improved glycemic control would be a way to say it. But I'll digress. Reduction in diabetes mellitus complications, lowering blood cholesterol, modulating gut bacteria, increasing gastrointestinal viscosity, and reducing the impact of other medications. So you can see that there's definitely benefit of these beta glucans in and above and beyond these basically the other anti-cancer effects, which we'll see later in the line. So this paper is titled Effect of Dietary Supplementation with Oat Beta Glucans After 3 months. So remember, this is a kind of a longer 3-month study, and people with type 2 diabetes mellitus, a randomized double-blind controlled clinical trial. It says here that for 12 weeks, subjects were given a daily oat beta glucan or a placebo, which was microcrystalline cellulose, as a control and they only got 5 grams per day. 5 grams of beta glucans per day. We determined that in fasting blood glucose, C-peptide, insulin, HOMA, A1C, lipid profile, ghrelin, leptin, GLP-1, PYY, caloric intake, and intestinal microbiota, A1C decreased in the beta glucan group. So it didn't give me the full story because I think this was behind a paywall. Luckily, the next paper using the same kind of well, this is actually a systemic review and meta-analysis of using oats and oat beta glucans for improvements in glycemic control. And it showed here that, so again, these people were getting these beta glucans for at least 2 weeks, okay, not very long amount of time. And you're already seeing benefits. So they use 8 trials, it looks like. And these people were predominantly middle-aged, overweight, and treated with anti-hyperglycemic medications or insulin. So these were, either full diabetics or insulin-dependent diabetics. And they got a dose of only 3.25 grams on average of beta-glucans for only 4.5 weeks. And there was a nearly 0.5% decrease in A1C after just 4.5 weeks of a pretty low dose of beta-glucans. So needless to say, prebiotics are extremely powerful on a variety of body systems. But in particular, when we're looking at cancer as a mitochondrial metabolic disease, and we're looking at ways to improve our glycemic control because we want to get our blood glucose down to below that average of 80, and we want to get the glucose ketone index down as low as possible, ideally 1 or less, then we need as many tools in our tool bag as possible. And these prebiotic fibers can be a big way to improve that situation for you so that you can implement the other aspects of metabolic therapy. If you're going to invest in yourself into those treatment modalities, which I do believe are worth it, and I do believe are powerful, but you do need to have this being kind of the foundational principle. I mean, do I believe there's more than do I believe there's more of a foundational principle than just blood glucose, like proposed by Dr. Seyfried? Yes, I think that circadian rhythms and all these other things, vitamin D and melatonin, by getting adequate sun exposure and adequate dark exposure is actually as important as this. But again, we're looking at cancerous metabolic disease from the perspective of Dr. Seyfried, and that's getting your blood glucose down and your blood ketone index down. And so we want to give you as many tools in your tool bag as possible to achieve that. And I hope that this gives you at least 3 additional tools: psyllium, inulin, and beta glucans, as well as just dietary fiber in general, soluble dietary fiber in general, as a way to help lower your blood glucose. I was planning on hitting probiotics, I'll be honest with you. But that being said, I just think we're already an hour in, so let's just hit that the next time. I have some other things that we'll share as well. We'll talk about probiotics, and we'll talk about some mind-body exercises, or practices, which are powerfully, surprisingly powerful at lowering your blood glucose. So we'll talk about that. So let me look at some of these comments. So, can you have a blood glucose of less than 80 and still not be ketogenic or be in the right state and be successful with metabolic therapy? Is the GKI of less than 2 what matters? They both matter. They both matter. So normal physiology would be that your blood glucose gets down. Okay. Glucose is no longer available as a fuel source. Your body ramps up ketones. Okay. It's an opposite effect. As glucose rises, ketones go down. Okay. As glucose goes down, ketones go up. Right. So it's an inverse relationship, but the GKI is important. Okay. But also the blood glucose on average is, and remember, it is a ratio, right? So if your if you're, let's say hypothetically, you're supplementing with ketones and you're taking a bunch of MCT oil and you're really raising your ketones, but your blood glucose is, above 80, but your GKI is good, that's not ideal. We would want your blood glucose to be even further down, and maybe you would rely less on MCT oils or exogenous ketones to get your GKI to where we want it to be. That makes sense. Is it possible long-term fasting would put you in a ketogenic state, but how long would you be able to sustain it? That's a great question, Enrique. I mean, no one knows the answer to that. I mean, it's going to be an N=1 case by case basis. Are you a 300-pound diabetic, who is morbidly obese? Well, obviously that person's going to be able to do longer term fasting and not really have any, probably problems. However, if you're 80-pound grandma who's cachectic, then that would be probably, not a good idea, right? So it's going to be a case by case basis, depending on you and your doctor coming together and putting together a plan. I just came across this and am interested to investigate further. Me too. Is it Wi-Fi or are you lagging? So what I've understand is that when I use the DSLR camera, it has a better image quality. I get some bokeh effect because it's got a low shallow depth of field. But for whatever reason, I don't know if it's my capture card. I don't know if it's my MacBook Pro, which is about 3 years old, if it's something to do with but it just seems to lag when I do that. If I use my iPhone camera or if I use my really crappy MacBook camera, it doesn't lag at all. So my guess is it's probably something to do with the processor or the connection between the camera. Sorry. What's the fastest supplement to lower blood glucose? I added berberine and chromium and similaurin and ASEA a couple of weeks ago, but I'm not seeing much. I'm also using red light before a meal if it helps a bit. So I think it's going to be a case-by-case basis, to be honest with you. I would focus on the most powerful ones. So like you're doing chromium, milk thistle. I think, cinnamon is also pretty darn powerful. And so is these prebiotic fibers. So, you may want to look at that. You also probably need, I don't know if you're doing it or not, but you may want to look at are you tracking calories? Are you tracking macros? Like, are you using like Chronometer or MyFitnessPal and looking at your, macronutrient ratios? Are you doing any intermittent fasting? What's your A1C? What's your fasting blood glucose? Your fasting insulin? All these things. Like, it depends on your state before you implement these therapies. Now, kind of like going at it from a more nuanced approach. I mean, most of these studies are conducted, most of them are longer than 2 months, longer than 3 months, even, 3-6 month therapies to get that, 0.5 decrease in A1C or 0.7% decrease in A1C, right? The most impressive one was kind of like this one with the beta glucans, which was just a 4-week study basically. And they saw basically 0.47, almost a 0.5% decrease in A1C. And I believe the Psyllium one was only a 2-month study, 8 weeks, and it showed a 1.1% decrease in A1C. So I think that it's kind of, I don't know the answer, I mean, everyone's a little bit different, but I think that if it was me, I would focus on how would I word this? I would focus on things that are having the pleiotropic effects, because what happens is you end up taking too much stuff, right? Or it becomes overwhelming because you're taking 30 different pills a day. And I can empathize with that. And I have to catch myself because I want to get so aggressive with people's plans. It gets overwhelming for people. So my point is that you could probably do it in 2 ways. You could focus on your blood sugar first, okay, for a period of time, maybe 4 or 8 weeks, get your blood sugar maximally down and improve your glycemic control. And then maybe keep some of the supplements and things that are going to help dovetail into metabolic therapy. So like milk thistle, things like berberine, things like resveratrol, maybe even lipoic acid or things like that have effects on glucose uptake, glucose utilization, inside the cell when it comes to glycolysis, or shutting down the Warburg effect through hypoxemic factors or PDK inhibition, or potentially like looking at things that block glutamine uptake and glutamine utilization as well, right? So I want to when I pick things in my protocols, and this is a inexact science, and it's just like I'm learning as I go as well, but I want to pick something that has as many touch points on things that are really critical within cancerous metabolic disease as possible. So I hope that somewhat answers your question, but it's just, there's a lot of question marks. I don't know you. I think red light therapy has an immediate effect. I think doing like exercise outside or exercise in front of a red light therapy panel could be give you immediate effects, but you're gonna have to play around with it. Most of these are carbs, which become glucose. So how cost benefit analysis? Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. Some of these sources of things like oats, I wouldn't use that as my source of beta glucans. I would be looking at medicinal mushrooms, particularly turkey tail, which is like 46% beta glucans, which is not going to affect your blood glucose at all because it has no carbohydrates in it, right? And yes, beta glucans, fructooligosaccharides, inulin, fibers, psyllium, they're all carbohydrates, but they're carbohydrates that our body can't break down. That's what makes them fiber, and that's what allows them to get passed down into the colon and be utilized by the colonic bacteria that can break them down as carbohydrates. Thank you, doctor, for all you useful information. Much appreciated. Greetings from Belgium. Well, greetings from Florida. Amazing presentation. Thank you very much. Which one towers over them all? Well, as of today, I would say that psyllium is probably the most powerful. It has on average, a 1.0 to 1.1 decrease in A1C. Second most powerful is probably inulin at about 0.7% decrease in A1C. Is keto not a good idea if you're cachectic? Yeah, that's an N equals 1, question. Could you get away with being on a ketogenic diet but not calorie restricted, for example, if you're cachectic? Could you cycle the ketogenic diet or cycle calorie restriction? How aggressive do you want your ketogenic diet? Keto's not keto. There's ketogenic diets with a less than 10% carbohydrates or less than 10% protein, and there's ketogenic diets with 25% protein. I think it's going to have to be a little bit more detailed question in that between you and your doctor. Have you done any videos on the effects of fatty fish on fasting blood glucose? I have not. No. You are the best. Thanks for all your information. Ground flax seeds, hibiscus tea are helpful. Thank you for your input there, Scott. And vitamin D is also helpful. Yeah, vitamin D. We talked about vitamin D towards the beginning of this series, at being able to lower blood glucose. The effect is not that strong. I think in meta-analyses, if I'm reaching here, I think it's about 0.4% on A1C with vitamin D supplementation and about 0.4% from K2. I'd really be curious if you had a vitamin D3 K2 supplement, what that would do in terms of synergy, but don't have that data. But it's not near as powerful, but vitamin D has other unbelievably powerful things at shutting down glucose uptake utilization, as well as glutamine uptake and utilization. So definitely other huge benefits of vitamin D. And as always, I'll have to make the caveat. I don't recommend vitamin D supplementation for most people. I recommend getting it from the sun first and foremost, and then maybe secondarily, maybe artificial ultraviolet B. Will you do a video on iodine and anti-cancer? I'm open to doing a video on literally anything, Elias. I don't have it on the slate of things to talk about yet, but I would be willing to, absolutely. All right, we've gone an hour and 8 minutes, guys, talking about prebiotics only. Wow. Let's cut it off today. If you like videos like this, please like it. If you have people in your life or if people you love, have struggling with glycemic control, with diabetes, with obesity, or with, lowering their blood glucose and GKI to fully implement metabolic therapy effectively, please share this with them. And until next time.